Welcome to Changing Higher Ed, a podcast dedicated to helping higher education leaders improve their institutions. With your host, Dr. Drumm McNaughton, CEO of The Change Leader, a consultancy that helps higher ed leaders holistically transform their institutions. Learn more at changinghighered.com. And now, here's your host, Drumm McNaughton.
Thank you, David. Our guest today is William Brit Kirwan, Chancellor Emeritus of the University System of Maryland. Brit is a nationally recognized authority on the critical issues facing higher education. He has served as Chancellor of the University System of Maryland for 13 years, President of the Ohio State University for 4 years, and President of the University of Maryland College Park for 10 years. Prior to his presidency, he was a member of the University of Maryland Mathematics faculty for 24 years. Brit is a past chair of, among other boards, the American Council of Education, the Association of Public and Land-Grant Universities, the American Association of Colleges and Universities, and the Business Higher Education Forum, and the National Research Council Board on Higher Education and Workforce. In other words, Brit knows higher education, especially from the perspective of having sat in the big chair. Brit joins us today in this, the first of a two-part podcast, to talk about the challenges facing university presidents, why their tenures have become so short, and what can be done to remedy that. Brit, welcome to the show.
Well, Drumm, it's great to be with you.
Likewise, we've done a lot of work together on governance issues and things like this. You've given me some great guests for the podcast, but this is a first for us, you being on the podcast.
Well, I want you to know I'm honored, and I've enjoyed working with you and learned a great deal from you.
Likewise, my friend. And each time, I don't want this to turn into the Mutual Admiration Society, but having said that, each time we get a chance to work together, I am even more amazed at the depth of your knowledge and your experience.
You're too kind.
And I can't think of anyone who is more well qualified. That's a department, a redundancy department, better well qualified. Yeah. Anyway, I can't think of anyone better qualified to talk about our subject today, which is what's going on with presidents' tenures. Why are they getting shorter, et cetera?
Well, I've been through a lot of battles, so I hope I can share some of those experiences with you.
Oh, I suspect when I take a look at the list of folks who have been in the big chair, I think I know of only one president who we both know, Gordon Gee, who's been in that chair longer. You've got tremendous experience, and we're going to tap into it. So,
the interesting thing about Gordon is I was both his successor and his predecessor at Ohio State.
We're not going to go there with that one. No, Gordon's a wonderful man. He's doing incredible things at West Virginia, things that are very, very difficult to do. I honor him with that because he's doing it and he's staying around to make sure it gets done properly.
Right.
So tell us a little bit about, half the people in higher ed already, they already know your background. But for those who, that other half that do not, please give us a little bit about your background.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll try to keep this short, but I was born and raised in Lexington, Kentucky. My father had a long association with the University of Kentucky. When I was born, believe it or not, he was the football coach at the university.
Really? I didn't know that.
And then later became a very distinguished history professor, quit coaching during World War II when there was no football teams, and went to Duke and got his PhD and came back and was a very distinguished history professor, and then became president of the university. So, I grew up in a family that lived and breathed higher education. So it was very natural for me to pursue a career in higher education. And his discipline was history. Mine, it turned out, was mathematics. And so when I graduated from the University of Kentucky, it was at the time when the nation was so concerned about the Soviet Union made in spacecraft. They created this very well-funded program called the National Defense Education Act that gave fellowships for people who would go and get a PhD in math and the physical sciences. And so I was fortunate enough to get one of those fellowships and went to Rutgers and got my PhD at Rutgers in mathematics. And then my wife and I moved to Maryland, where I took my first job at the University of Maryland, and then spent 24 wonderful years as a first assistant and then an associate and then a full professor of mathematics. Loved being a professor, teaching and doing research and so on. And it came my turn to be department chair. So I was department chair for 4 years, and then all of a sudden the university needed a provost. I was asked to step into that role. So I became the provost of the university and served in that capacity for 7 years, and then president of University of Maryland for a decade, which, I think is roughly as long, in my personal opinion, as someone ought to be leading an institution. There are many successful presidents who've served much longer tenures, and I certainly respect that. But then I went to Ohio State, had a wonderful experience there, but Maryland came calling again and asked me to come back and be the chancellor of the 12 campus University of Maryland system. And I did that in 2002 and stayed in that position to 2015 when I stepped down. And I've been doing consulting with good people like you since then on governance issues and serving on a bunch of boards and still playing a lot of tennis and enjoying life.
Well, that's really good. I want to circle back to your father, though.
Yeah.
I didn't know, he may be one of the first, if not the first person who's been a football coach to move into a presidency. The other two that I know, Jim Tressel.
Yes, absolutely. I hired Jim Tressel when I was at Ohio State.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and he's been the president of the university, which slips my mind now, for about 8 years.
Youngstown State.
Youngstown State, thank you. And then there is Roger Hughes, who is the president up at Doane.
Uh-huh. Well, there was one at actually my institution, Maryland, where I'm still very involved. Curly Byrd was a famous, infamous, I might almost say, president of the University of Maryland. And he started out as a football coach and later became the president. He never became a faculty member the way my father did, but he also was another one that went that route.
Yeah, well, Roger went from football coach to, he went to a different university. He had been at Doane before, went to Princeton, turned around that program, and then they hired him back at Doane as the president. Regardless, though, it's an amazing background. Unlike our friend Gordon, you've been able to hold a job. He's gone from other places, multiple. And Gordon, if you're listening to this, I love you, brother. But, you've seen a lot. You've got the Maryland system is 12 campuses, I think I heard you say.
Yes.
You've been very much involved with multiple campuses over the past 20 years. The tenure for a university president has decreased a little bit. I think that's probably a nice way to say it. I think I just read, it's down from over 10 years to 3.7. I mean, what's going on? This is crazy.
Yeah. I didn't realize it had gotten down that low, although I knew it had length of tenure had been declining significantly. Well, I have to say, being a university president has become a very difficult. It was always difficult, but it has become a much more difficult, even in the relatively brief time since I stepped down as chancellor of the University of Maryland system. And I think there's a number of factors that are making it so difficult right now.
You mean besides elections, right?
Well, I mean, to some extent, the great divisions we have in our country can't help but be reflected in higher education and, in fact, all walks of life. But I think what I would say that, I was a president or chancellor for 28 years, and there was never a time when there was as much political interference and influence on higher education. We obviously see this in Texas. We see it in Florida, North Carolina. But, even it's not just southern states. There was a bill introduced in Ohio a very anti-DEI bill that really would put restrictions on what higher education could do on issues of diversity. So there's this pushback on DEI, I think, is a totally new dynamic. When I was president and chancellor, diversity and inclusion were the watchword and the password of every institution. It was part of our culture, our aspiration to be more inclusive. And in a relatively short time, that is totally reversed in many, many states. And, this puts the president between a rock and a hard place. On the one hand, in many states, the president is under enormous pressure to political influence on what can be taught, how it can be taught, how money can be spent on inclusion issues. And on the other hand, you've got the faculty that live and breathe this culture of inclusion. And the president kind of has to find his or her way between these two very opposite forces. So I think it's a huge factor that is affecting the presidency. I feel board governance, something you and I have been working on, these divisions in political and beliefs, et cetera, have influenced boards. And so boards have become much more directive and engaged in operational issues. And I think board governance overall, good governance has declined. I mean, you see all sorts of boards going rogue boards at universities, and even at some of our best institutions. I think a classic case is the University of Virginia, which is arguably one of the great, well, not arguably, it is one of the great public universities in the United States. And you would think, well, a place like that with this long history, Mr. Jefferson's University, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, they would have governance right. Well, just a few years ago, the board chair didn't like what the president was doing, thought the president wasn't moving fast enough on some issues, brought the president into a meeting, told her that they were having a board meeting that day and wanted her to announce her resignation, and had not cleared that with anybody else on the board. And they go into a board meeting and the board chair starts, well, our president has an announcement to make. And the president says, well, I'm stepping down. Many on the board, their mouths drop open. What? Why is this happening? Why are you doing this? Well, that is such flawed governance when things like that can happen at very distinguished institutions. So I think that's a factor. Mm-hmm. There are funding issues that are mounting, and I think they're going to get much worse. You mentioned Gordon Gee. I think West Virginia has a $70 million deficit. Gordon's trying to address those funding issues by making, he's going to have to cut programs. Nothing else you can do. You got to get rid of programs. You can't possibly do any other way. Well, you can imagine the faculty don't like that. They don't want programs cut. Mm-hmm. So we got faculty morale issues on our campuses. And then fundraising has become such an essential part of the president's role. It's always been, thought of as a 24/7 job, but boy, it is 24/7 on steroids. And then finally, I'd mention for those institutions that are involved in big time intercollegiate athletics, what's going on in intercollegiate athletics is you couldn't even have conceived of it 10 years ago. Players earning over $1 million, coaches earning $10 million, and universities cobbling together money to try to keep this expensive enterprise afloat, and schools jumping from one conference to another, and on and on and on. So there's a whole myriad of issues that it's a perfect storm in a way, that have zeroed in on universities and in particular on presidents. And I think that's why we're seeing these tenures decline and presidents. Look, I mean, over this summer, we've had 5 or 6 major university presidents announce their resignation, probably not on the timing course that they had originally felt they would follow.
Yeah, no, definitely. I want to circle back to the thing, talking about board governance.
Yeah.
We have seen, and, this touches on the political as well. The governor of Florida has directed his attorney general to file a lawsuit against the Department of Education having to do with changing accreditors. And yeah, that's fine. But one of the big things driving that is who owns the university. All accreditors, or pretty much all accreditors, have what they call independent board policies, which originated really with the advent of for-profit education and making sure that the university can do what it needs to do. This Florida lawsuit is pushing back against that, saying they are a public university, they're funded by the state, we own it, we should be able to direct what they teach. So that's just one more factor that plays into the challenges that university presidents have. I mean, when I think about it, the most difficult position in a corporation is that of director, because you're having to take policy and translate it into operations. Mm-hmm. What all these challenges with the political and with the board stuff is it's making the presidents do that role. You're having other people set policy, set direction, which is part of the board's thing, but it's supposed to be done in parallel and jointly. Mm-hmm. You're getting the board stepping into areas that they shouldn't be stepping into, i.e., what can you teach?
Right. What can you teach? Who can you hire? And,
exactly.
I mean, the famous case at Chapel Hill, the board wouldn't let the appointment, wouldn't grant tenure to this distinguished journalist. Same thing happened just recently at Texas A&M. And you know so well, better than most, how this intrusion into the curriculum and into appointments, et cetera, flies in the face of best governance practices in higher education. People say, and I think it's true, we have the best system of higher education in the world, the best universities. I worry whether or not that statement we can going to be able to continue to make that statement going forward, but that's how it's viewed. And I think in large part it has been true because governing boards accepted the fact that they were independent. They had to act independently of state government. Public universities, obviously privates do, but the public universities. And that was respected. And it was, built into the modus operandi in state after state. And I know in Ohio and in Maryland, and I've known from colleagues I have elsewhere that boards would take pride in the fact that they had this independence, that their allegiance was to the best interest of the university, not the appointing authority that brought them to their position on the board. That seems to be going away in our country.
You and I have seen this up front and close and personal,
right,
with certain boards who will remain nameless having more allegiance to the people that have appointed them.
Right. Yeah. You and I both do continuing education for governing boards. And this is a point that I hammer on, that, as I'm sure you do, when I'm talking about, the role of the board and its independence and da-da-da-da-da. I'm thinking a lot of boards are going to look at you and say, no, not this board in this environment, which is very troubling. And if this trend continues, it is going to do irreparable harm to the quality of higher education. I mean, I don't know how I could be a president in a Florida university. I have, those folks who are and are doing the best they can down there. I got great respect for them and appreciate what they are trying to do. But, when you're captured by the views and the politics of the elected officials in the state, you really lose such a fundamental aspect of what higher education is supposed to be.
Why would anybody at this point want to be a university president?
That's a great question. I've thought about that, and two things occur to me that enables universities to continue to find presidents. First of all, the traditional route is you're a faculty member and you become a full professor, and then you get into administration. And so you sort of start going up the administrative ladder, and the top of that ladder is the president. And it's sort of in our nature to continue to want to advance.
New challenges.
The challenges, yeah. And I think it's just part of human nature that if you're in a hierarchical system of, in this case, administration, quite a number of people are going to want to rise to the top. Mm-hmm. The other thing, and let's be honest, salaries for presidents, and not only salaries, compensation packages for presidents it's escalated dramatically.
Really?
Listing the salaries of public university presidents, and the number of presidents earning $1 million. I mean, it's mouths dropped open when a public university president was getting that kind of compensation. Now it's commonplace. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. And it's not just the salary. You live in a big house, you have cars, people drive you, and you have all these benefits. And there are many aspects of the life which sound and look very appealing. And then you've got these golden handcuffs and buyout packages and whatever. And so there is a very substantial financial reward, and that's undoubtedly a reason why you see people willing to take on some of these very difficult challenges we've just been talking about.
Mm-hmm. But then we have to remember, if you really want to go for compensation, you go to be a head football coach instead of a president. You've got far less headaches. Well, instead of having a football coach, you've got 100 players maybe on your team, right, or whatnot. Here at the university, you've probably, between students and everything, you may have 40 to 70,000. Right. So you've got far more headaches. You've got the political process. As a head football coach, all you have to do is worry about win and lose, and hopefully you're not, abusing or harassing your players too much.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's interesting. You mentioned football coaches. I think in every state in the union except Alaska, the football coach is the highest paid public official in the state.
Sure. Doesn't surprise me at all. I mean, I have to say that as a testimony to what's a nice way of putting this? It's a testimony to the value system of what we think is important here in this country.
Yeah. Well, this is a topic for a different day, but, I think what intercollegiate athletics, big time intercollegiate athletics, is doing to our universities today, it's a great disservice. And universities are forced to live in a very hypocritical, presidents are supposed to live in a very hypocritical way. On the one hand, they've got these values that are driven by the academy that they adhere to and are in the mission of the institution on the one hand. On the other hand, all these excesses and enormous expenditures, outsized expenditures for intercollegiate athletics that make it totally in contrast to the investment in the academy.
Oh, most definitely. And just kind of an aside, I reached out to Amy Perko, who I know you know very well.
Yes.
And she's going to be coming back onto the podcast to talk about a lot of these same things.
Oh, great. Well, Amy is, I've worked with Amy very closely. I was on the chair of the Knight Commission for a period of time, and she is exceptional.
Oh, she certainly is.
We'll have a great interview with her.
Yeah. So, well, gosh, I can't believe how quickly this has gone. We've reached the first half of this podcast.
Wow.
We certainly have. It's amazing. And, with that, I'm going to ask guests, listeners, to tune in next week for the conclusion of this great show with William Brit Kirwan. Brit, thanks for being on the show. We'll see you next week.
It's been a pleasure. Love chatting with you, Drumm.
Likewise. Thanks for listening, and a special thank you to our guest, Dr. William Brit Kirwan. Tune in next week for the conclusion of my conversation with Brit on presidential turnover, what's going on, and what can be done.
Changing Higher Ed is a production of The Change Leader, a consultancy committed to transforming higher ed institutions. Find more information about this topic, along with show notes on this episode, at changinghighered.com. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to the show, and we would also value your honest rating and review. Email any questions, comments, or recommendations for topics or guests to podcast@changinghighered.com. Changing Higher Ed is produced and hosted by Dr. Drumm McNaughton, post-production by David L. White.